Right, good evening. Last year we cruised up the coast of Norway, and I'll cover that this evening, but it's not a log of what we did. It's a bit of a mixed bag, really focusing on things we came across that we thought would be of interest to the members of the Old Gaffers. So maritime heritage, maybe a bit of sailing related. So it's a mix of things in there in total. I'm not an expert on Norway and don't claim to be. It's just our experience from a season cruising up there. But before getting into talk about Norway in particular, just to look at the scale of Norway. Norway is huge. If you're in the south of Norway, it's 542 miles. And by the way, all the distances I'll give today is in miles, nautical miles, about 2 kilometres. But it's about 542 miles to Dublin. It's 866 to Florence. Kyiv is 922. But the north of Norway, Nordkapp, is 915. So you're as near to Kyiv from the south of Norway as you are to the north of Norway. You're nearly twice as near to Dublin as you are the north of Norway. It really is huge. And if you look at Ireland, Connemara is about 60 miles from Kerry, it's about 80 miles from Donegal, and we know the variation you have in those short distances. So when you have 10 times that distance in Norway, you're going to have a huge amount of variation, as we found as we went up. The population of Norway is about 5.5 million, and its coastline is 55,000 miles. It's the second longest coastline in the world after Canada. It's got 240,000 islands. Now, exactly how you measure an island, but the usual definition, 240,000. It really is just extraordinary scale. Although it is very far north, well into the Arctic Circle, it is not actually as cold as you would think it is. The Gulf Stream barrels up the coast of Norway, keeping the water temperature there warm right around the year. During the summer, the water temperatures are actually warmer than we encountered on the southwest coast of Ireland. I can boast about swimming 300 kilometres north of the Arctic Circle, but that's easy in Norway. The water is warm. And also, when you're in Norway, when you get there, the sailing up the Norwegian coast is very pleasurable and very easy. It's easier than, say, the west coast of Ireland. And you'll see why when we touch on things, but you're always near somewhere. There's good shelter, there's little swell. So, back in May of last year, this bunch left Kilrush. Michael Weed from Inishbofin and Donegal with us tonight. Paddy Barry needs absolutely no introduction to anybody. Pat O'Shea lived in Ennis for the past 40 years, and myself. So the plan was, the first leg of the voyage was Kilrush to St. Kilda. We left Kilrush, mixed weather, quite nice. There's Michael as we're locking out, and Paddy and Pat looking ahead. Down the Shannon, that's the tip of Mount Brandon, in the distance, up the coast. We had northerlies. We were tacking up the coast for a couple of days, which wasn't maybe the best of ideas. There's Paddy with the tip of Achill Island in the distance. And on we went. A weather system came in a little earlier and a little stronger than we expected. So we diverted to Barra, in Castle Bay in Barra. A nice sail going there. Obviously, I'm a bit selective with the photograph, but we were touching 11 knots at times, that wind behind us. So into Castle Bay on Barra, we spent a day or so there, just waiting for the weather system to pass over, and then on to Kilda. So here is Paddy as we're approaching St. Kilda itself. Now, St. Kilda is 35 miles off the North Uist in Scotland. It's 88 miles off the Scottish mainland. It is very isolated. There are 3 main islands, Borray, you're seeing over there, Herta and Sua behind us there. Herta itself, the biggest one, is about 2 miles long and 1 mile wide. So we anchored in Village Bay, which is about the only tenable anchorage on the island, and it's very exposed depending on the wind condition, but it was fine when we were there. Nobody lives permanently on St. Kilda anymore, but it used to be populated. The last 36 people were evacuated from it in 1930. The population peaked at 180 in the 17th century, which I found interesting. When you look at our islands on the west coast, typically they weren't that populated in the 17th century, and the population peaked in the 19th century, but here it peaked in the 17th century. Why, I don't know. But those inhabitants, when they moved to the mainland, had real difficulty settling in. On St. Kilda, totally remote, they didn't have a money system, they'd never seen or used money, for instance. Their social norms were very different, and apparently life was tough for them to get to grips with the new existence on the mainland. So, we arrived in Kilda and we were looking forward to the scenic views and a nice walk around. So we climbed the main peak there, Mulkmore, about 360 metres. And a good view, it certainly wasn't. Quite a lot of low cloud. You couldn't even see only a few metres up the stays of the mast. But moving around the island, moving further over, the cloud cleared a bit. And again, this is looking down on Village Bay. But on Kilda, there are these little stone buildings called cleats. They're open to the weather. They're not windproof. There are 1,300 of them on the island, and apparently they're unique to St. Kilda. Used for a combination of maybe storage of foodstuffs, to hang and dry things that needed to be preserved, like birds, etc. The other thing, we were very lucky when we were in Kilda, in that it was a clear night and it was the greatest display of northern lights in years, the Aurora Borealis. So we were very lucky to be there. We were unlucky in that we knew nothing about it until the next day, so we slept through it and didn't see it at all. Also, another interesting thing in Kilda are these sheep. They were feral sheep on the island next door, Soa, and apparently they are a Neolithic breed. That they are the original undomesticated sheep, and every domesticated sheep in the world apparently is descended from that breed, and it's about the only place that breed remained intact. So the view from the top of the island, that's looking over at Borray. The next day we set off to head for the Orkneys. So we called into a little anchorage called Talmine in the Kyle of Tongue. Amazing name in North Scotland. Very pretty, nice anchorage. Not a lot happening around there. And then the next day we made for Westray. Now, Westray is the 6th largest of the Orkney Islands. It's about 9 miles long and 5 miles wide. 600 people live there year round. And it's about 40 miles off the coast of Scotland. A very pleasant place. If any of you have seen the movie The Outrun by Saoirse Ronan, it was set and filmed within a couple of miles of there. So it's very, you'll have a good feeling of the place for that. But an interesting thing happened to us there. The harbour master, his name was Louis, very nice man, I'd say in his 30s, very gentle, quiet spoken. So he took our mooring fees, and I was asking him, diesel, we needed diesel, and he said no, the harbour didn't have it, but there's a company up the road that sells it if you've cans, which we did. So he gave me a lift up to the company. And who is it that's selling it in the company? But it was Louis. That night we went to the hotel and I had a fish I never had before called tusk. Very nice. Well, I probably did have it, but it was never served as tusk. And we were having a drink in the bar afterwards, and the barman said, "Oh yes, your chef was Louis." So Louis cooked that. And the reason the chef knew, or the barman knew it, is because the barman was Louis as well. So it really was sort of island life, do everything there. A little reminder of days gone by before Brexit appeared on the scene there, with the harbour being part funded by the EU. Then we set off for the coast of Norway via Fair Isle. So there's Pat keeping us on the straight and narrow with the noon sight. But onto Fair Isle itself. We stayed in North Haven, this little harbour here on the top of the island. Fair Isle is about 25 miles from Orkney, it's about 20 from Shetland, it's 70 from Scotland, it's 200 from Norway. It really is fairly isolated. It was a beautiful day when we were there and we walked all around it. Now this is particularly interesting. The rock behind Michael is called Sheep Rock. It's a sea stack. It's about 120 or 130 metres high. It's about 300 metres long, and it's vertical cliffs all around it. Not too uncommon, that bit of it. But the local farmers on Fair Isle, well into the 70s, used to hoist their sheep up that cliff at the start of the season and hoist them down again at the end of the winter. Quite extraordinary when you see it. So we had a good wander around the island. That's the west of there. The island itself is about 2.5 miles by 1 mile down to the western lighthouse and then back inland. Really, really nice. It was fantastic to get there, but one day you've probably seen it all. So then we headed off across the North Sea, and a fairly uneventful passage. It went well. There's Paddy amused at something as we reached the Norwegian coast and headed on to Bergen. So Bergen is Norway's second biggest city. It's a population of about 270,000. It had been the capital for a few centuries, and it was the largest city in Norway up to about 1830. So just zooming into there, very pretty, lovely. We arrived on Sunday, the sun splitting the rocks. This is looking down on the town from a local hill. This area here is very historic. It's a World Heritage Site. It's called Bergen. Old Hanseatic League harbour structure with old wooden warehouses. Very, very pretty. Now, Bergen, until the late 18th century, had a monopoly on all foreign trade from anywhere north of Bergen in Norway. So people living up the coast could not trade internationally. They had to come down to Bergen and sell to the Bergenese, or whatever the adjective is, the merchants there. And likewise, if they wanted to buy anything foreign, they had to buy it through those merchants in Bergen. Those merchants were rich. But it also meant that to get down there were these ships, this type of ship called a yacht, which they'd load up and they would sail down to Bergen with all their produce at the end of the season. They sell that and they buy whatever they'd need for the winter, and they would sail back up. And you see numerous of these yachts as you go along the coast. Bergen is the largest port still in Norway, both in terms of passenger numbers and freight. I mentioned we arrived on a Sunday when the sun was splitting the rocks. It so happens that the previous Friday was one of their bank holidays, Constitution Day. And because of when Easter fell, the Monday was a holiday, Whit Monday. So they had two bank holidays sandwiching that weekend. It was the first really good weekend of the year, and Bergen was buzzing. Boats were moored 4 deep all around the harbour, and it really was a bit of an experience being there. It's well preserved. It's a nice little city, quite cosmopolitan. Paddy and Pat left us, and Michael and myself had a few days to fill in. We weren't allowed spend, there's a limit in the amount of time you can actually spend in Bergen, So we decided to go somewhere local. And just by chance, we picked this place called Sør-Skjome, just a few miles from Bergen. A little harbour, very pretty, with a fairly big rock in it. There are no tides in Bergen, and so there are lots of fixed wooden wharfs around it. Now, here is us moored, here is that big rock behind us, here are a few sheds on it. So exploring those sheds were most interesting. There were sort of warehouses or workshops, I should say. There were boats in there were wooden materials. It turned out that this is an association called the Askøy, which is the name of the island, Coastlag, which means Coastal Association. And they were set up in 1992, and their aims, according to their literature, is to strengthen our identity as coastal people and to involve children and young people in the work of passing on knowledge to new generations. So very, very like what we in the Old Gaffers are trying to do as well. These guys here had 9 boats in all working order. They really try and involve children, young people. They want those boats and encourage those boats to be used. Just an example or two, this is a boat, an 8-metre fishing boat built in 1930. Another one here, a little small fishing boat built in 1938. It was engineless until 58 when they installed a 2-stroke, 2.5 horsepower inboard engine. So it really was, purely by coincidence, we ended up there. Michael and I then went back to Bergen, and I had to go to the chandlery. We went out to the chandlers, and right beside the chandlers were these old boats. And it so happens it was right beside the Norwegian Fishery Museum, which we didn't go into, I think. We were talking about it, but we didn't actually go into the museum. But those boats, just, everywhere you look around Norway, you see heritage boats. Now, the Norwegian Fishing Museum will feature in a little while too. So Michael flew back to Dublin, and my wife Dawn and the dog flew out, and we then spent 3 months taking a sort of an exploratory gander up the coast of Norway. It was just the two of us for most of the time. Some family came over for maybe a week here or a week there, but in general it was the two of us. We left Bergen and we wanted to really get around up to Ålesund, so we stopped we just made rapid progress up there. But this point up here, between the island of Kilda and just north of the island of Kilda, is a headland called Strat. And it looks fairly harmless, but it has a fearsome reputation. The Norwegian Sea and the North Sea meet at that point. They are vicious seas, can build up. They have recorded in 1 year, I don't know which year, 100 days of storm on the point there. It causes small boats problems, it causes big boats problems. In fact, the Norwegian Lifeboat Association organise convoys around it. So small boats can meet up, the convoy goes off accompanied by the lifeboat to get around there. We got through it, it was a nice day, no problem at all. But the Norwegians, this causes problems for bigger ships like the ferries, like the Hurtigruten, which goes up and down the coast. So the Norwegians are in the process of building a tunnel, just to cut out the headland altogether. It'll be the first full-scale ship tunnel in the world. It'll be about 1 mile long. They hope construction will start this year or next year. It went out to tender last year. They think it might take about 6 years to construct. It will have a draft of 12 metres, 37 metres wide. The design point is that it has an air draft of 30 metres, but they expect and they want this tunnel to last quite a while. They are building it at 33 metres to be able, as a contingency against rising sea levels. And one thing, Norwegians are very literal and factual, and there's an official site talking about the tunnel when it comes in, and there was a question and answer section on it, and I was very amused by one of the pieces of information they were giving out. They said that recreational boats must be motorised. So anyone thinking of sailing through the the mile-long tunnel would be disappointed. I mentioned air draft there. That's something that is in Norway. Bridges can come in any height. A lot of them are high, but a lot of them aren't. It's obviously fine if they're 5 or 10 metres, but you get them coming in at 15 or 18, so you need to be very, very careful. I mean, that one there is 30 metres, we only need 20. But even still, it was for the first few times, it was, you look and you double check and you're a bit nervous. So, on a lot of the coast of Norway is sheltered by outlying islands. So they have what they call the inner lead, that you can sail up, and the big ships can go up, very, very sheltered from the sea, and beautiful sailing a lot of the time. The wind typically, we found, well, it was beautiful this year. It may not be beautiful next year or the year after this year or next year when we're coming down. It was mainly southerly winds. On then to the city of Ålesund, which is a population of 55,000 people. It's the 10th biggest city in Norway, and it is regularly voted as being the most beautiful city in Norway, or the most desirable place to get to. And the reason, this is looking down on the town from a height, the reason, or one of the main reasons for that is, like a lot of Norwegian towns, it was made of wood. And there was a devastating fire in the early 20th century, and the whole place was just ruined, just burnt to the ground. And for some reason, Kaiser Wilhelm had an interest from Germany, nothing to do with Norway, had an interest in Ålesund, and sent 4 warships with building materials, and somehow internationally famous architects were brought on board, and they rebuilt the whole city in the style of the time, Art Nouveau. So the whole town is absolutely preserved, Art Nouveau town, very, very pretty indeed. Centre waterway running through it, and that's it from the other side. Note the beautiful view of the mountains, or so you think. The next day, this is the view. 2 cruise ships arrived in. 4,000 people each. The town was overrun. I don't know how the locals put up with it. There's an earlier photograph I took from a height. There's a magnificent walk up to, not quite sure how high it is, a few hundred metres. We walked up there, beautiful steps all the way up. Unbeknownst to us, these ships arrived in when we were up there. And to try and walk down against the hordes of people walking up against you, it really wasn't pleasant at all. Now, we had a very interesting experience there, by the way. Everything I had read about clocking into Norway suggested you didn't really need to do anything. You had to notify customs, okay, but immigration was, no problem. But the situation might change. Anyway, we were in Ålesund and got a tap on the hull, and these 2 policemen were there who said, "Do you not know you were meant to have checked in?" And I said, "I'm terribly sorry, I wasn't aware of that. It's fine, don't worry at all. It's hard to find the information, but you should have, and they're updating the website." That was fine. He looked at my passport, he scanned it in, and he said, "Have a good time." Now, we had come across in an earlier port, just when we went around Stad, 2 boats had arrived in from Scotland, a British boat and a Swiss boat. And they both arrived in Ålesund after us. The cops made a beeline for the British boat. It wasn't a case of just looking at their photographs. They asked them to accompany them up to the police station, which they did. The British couple came back and they were furious. The cops had said to them, "Yeah, we see you were in Spain for 6 weeks, 3 months ago. You need to be out of Norway in 6 weeks." End of story. That's it. Meanwhile, The Swiss boat, who also came from Scotland, they didn't approach at all. So things are changing. So yeah, and you know immigration is changing. It was Brexit, totally Brexit, yeah. Also in Ålesund, there was this type of boat, a fishing boat in the 19th century, which was very common up there. It would fish the North Atlantic, the Norwegian seas, but the advent of steam totally made them obsolete, and in fact, the last one was destroyed in about 1915. None survived. But the Fish Museum in Bergen that I mentioned had a builder's model, and they commissioned a rebuild or a replica, which the Hardanger Maritime Centre were asked to build, which they did, and that's the boat here. And again, like everything else, there's signs up, the excursions every day or two, and they're all reasonably priced. They really try and milk or use all their heritage boats. Right, leaving Ålesund, we took the inner lead up to a group of islands called Bjørnsund. And these are a very exposed little archipelago, about 3 miles off land. But in the early 20th century, they built a whole series of breakwaters connecting the islands to form this really sheltered harbour inside. It was quite amazing the difference it would have made, but a huge undertaking for then. Here's just a map of there was on a sign there of the breakwaters, and the reason I show this is just to have a look at the names. Norwegian place names are very literal and very informative, and they typically have the form, for instance, not Holmen. A holm is an island, a little islet. N is a definite article. So that there is saying, it is the not really is the name of that small island. Or Brass Bua Sonnet, it is the Bua sound, it would have been that originally. Or Skar Berget, berg being, I took a list of all of these, a berg being a rock or a cliff. Another thing we saw in that last one was bard. So you build up an appreciation of what these things mean. So you're looking at a chart and you can quite quickly pick out, there's shelter, Var is shelter. It becomes very useful looking at Norwegian charts. So here's just a view of the shelter provided by the breakwaters. And note that little trawler there. Another view of the shelter provided here. At its peak, 700 people lived on the archipelago. In the 60s, the government decided they weren't going to support it anymore. They took apparently a very controversial decision to evacuate the islands, which was completed in 1972. So there aren't any permanent residents there anymore. There are a lot of holiday houses. There is no shop. There isn't even a seasonal shop there. Here's another view from the island. There's quite a sea rolling there. It would have been fairly miserable living on those islands before those breakwaters were put in. Anyway, during our exploration of the island, we came across this building which seemed a bit out of place. And later on, we were down at the harbour, and there's this old warehouse type thing, and we were looking for the person. There was a sign up about paying your mooring fees, and we didn't have a Norwegian bank account, so we were trying to find somebody to talk to, and said, come in here. And they brought us in through what was sort of an industrial kitchen into a social area, and there were about 5 or 6 people in their 50s or 60s, and we got talking to them, and they say they run a leirskole. In Norway, every 12-year-old in school, the class in school, gets either 1 or 2 weeks, can't remember, in a leirskole, which means a camp school. It's outdoor focused. It's to give the kids an appreciation of their heritage. And here it is all the people we were speaking to, and 2 of them in fact had sailed around Ireland, passionate about the sea, passionate about passing on that sense of maritime heritage and knowledge to the next generation. So that trawler, for instance, I mentioned, it belongs to the Lear School. All the kids are brought out on that. They trawl, they have to gut the fish, they cook the fish. They arrived in onto the island at about 8 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, they're out here rowing around the harbour. One kid there fishing, you can see the others over here, really having a fantastic time. They seem to be really excited, really pleased to be there. But we were touched by the way the sea is so important to their country and to their conscience, and how much effort they put into ensuring that's passed on to the next generation. Also, and coincidentally, when we were there, I had my little boat I built, Bogeen, which I love, and I love sailing. I had mislaid the sail. Turns out I left it in Ireland, and I didn't want to be without it. So I got a tarp and some tarp tape, and I made a sail complete with leech line, and you know, it sailed, and not as well as the sail Philip Watson had made. But again, look here, you know, the kids out playing around.
Very good.
Now, the next stop, Kristiansund. This is an exposed bit of coast, which you need to time it. And summer when we were there, by the way, last summer was exceptionally good weather. And all the locals said this has never happened before. And don't form your opinion on how good it is this year. But it was sunshine and heat day after day after day. You could be out at midnight just in your t-shirt sitting on deck. It just was fantastic. Anyway, Kristiansund is this harbour, this natural harbour between 3 islands. It is 18,000 people. It's the 32nd largest town in Norway. Fantastic natural shelter. That's just looking at it from one of the bridges, another view from behind. But an interesting little thing in Kristiansund is this little thing here, which is called the Sundbat, or sand, or straight boat. It is free public transport. It runs in a loop every half an hour between all the islands, and it's done that since 1876. And it's claimed that that's the oldest motorised, regular public transport system in the world. Just I came across this on the street. There were all these photographs. No idea what it is. It was just said it was the 60s, but I assume that's somebody going about their business before they built the bridges, you know, transporting the milkman, yeah. We were out for a walk and came across this building, didn't know what it was, and were attracted into it. And it was incredible. It was a church. An awful lot of their towns and a lot of their churches were destroyed during the war. And this, as it happens, and we just found it by accident, is considered the first fully or completely modern building in Norway. It was commissioned in 64. I mean, there were 60th birthday celebrations when we were there. But it was stunning. It really, talk about form and function and just a thing of beauty. A lot of the architecture in Norway is memorable in a good way. Kristiansund is for a few hundred years, it's been a major maritime centre. It is today, working on big trawlers there. I think he's fitting a bow thruster, so Moonshine isn't the only one up to that. Also, on the other side of that bay, in what were old workshops, is now a museum for the local boating association, or it seems to be a lot of voluntary work. A lot is going on in there. They've workshops with period tooling. They have many boats, all of them with a good description. Numerous Colin Archers built for the lifeboats. This, when we were out back on our boat, I've no idea what it is, just past us. I assume it was on charter or going out. Also, for example, just beside where we were moored, this little boat turned up one day. As far as I could see, it was just somebody in for an hour or two, maybe doing the shopping. As they do, the water is their major source of transport there. People have little motorboats. They zoom into the towns with them. They have a meal. They zoom home. They zoom in for the shopping or whatever. But I thought it was a nice looking boat. So yeah, here we are in Kristiansund. The next step is we went into this area here, Trondheim Fjord. A whole series of fairly small anchorages or pontoons on the way to Trondheim. But we were going through a narrow strait one day, a narrow passage, and fortunately, it wasn't fortunately, AIS told me a boat coming at about 30 knots. Turned out to be the ambulance. We were anchored, an hour later we dropped anchor out here. As far as we could see, the ambulance, which was just tied up to a small rickety pontoon, there was one person, it looked as if it was a patient, an older person, who came on board. They were doing something with him for an hour, and then he went. It's as if, I don't know, maybe his blood shots, I don't know. And then the ambulance zoomed off back to somewhere else. And I checked it on AIS, and all day long it's zooming from one place to another. But again, it's sort of their major source of communication and transport.
Big enough to be a hospital, maybe.
Well, yeah.
And little clinic. Yeah,
on the way, this just caught my fancy, I put it in, a little anchorage way up there. The island behind here is called Hitra, H-I-T-R-A. And remember in St. Kilda, H-I-R-T-A, very similar name. And also, I can't remember before capturing on film the reflection of cirrus cloud. So then on to Trondheim. Now Trondheim is Norway's third biggest city, and it's probably its most historic. Modern Norway was sort of founded around this area about 1,000 years ago. The river features very prominently in the town. It was the capital of Norway up to 13th century. Good crew is hard to get, but we were lucky to have a new recruit. Our granddaughter joined us with her parents for 10 days, which worked out very well and lovely to have her. But back to the historical significance of Trondheim. It had been called, and I'm never sure how to pronounce it, Nidaros or Nadiris. And Saint Olav, the patron saint of Norway, is buried here. He was a king who converted the country to Christianity. But the diocese of Nidaros was absolutely huge, extremely powerful and extremely rich. And when I say huge, it included, you'd guess, most of Norway. It included Svalbard. It included the Faroes. It included Iceland. It included Greenland. But what amazed me, it included the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Hebrides, and down to the Isle of Man. So it was this really, really powerful, rich diocese. The Archbishop of the diocese, very, very powerful. Norway was unioned with Denmark, and the King of Denmark was very jealous. So this is what I picked up from the folk park. This is the story is told. Very aggravated and jealous of the wealth and power of the Archbishop. Around the same time, the King of Denmark converted to Lutheranism. And the suggestion was it was to be able to get rid of the Archbishop and get his hands on the power and money of the diocese, which he did. The inside of the church itself, it was built, it dates from 1070, fallen into bad disrepair in the 19th century. I think even the roof was off it. With the resurgence of Norwegian nationalism in the 19th century, they started to renovate it. So it started in the 1860s. The renovation wasn't actually completed until 2000. But it's spectacular. All the kings of Norway, for instance, are crowned in there. And that organ, the photograph there doesn't really do it justice. It is spectacular. It is stunning the way the old columns are complemented by the shape of where they place the pipes. The organ itself was built, I think, in about 1930 and then moved there in the 60s. On the other end of the spectrum, church-wise, they have these churches called stave churches, which are unique to Scandinavia. They're basically made of wood, and stave refers to the particular type of construction. But they're made of wood, attached with dowels, etc. The interesting thing about them is when a community needed a bigger church, what they do is they disassemble a church and build a new one. and they moved the disassembled one somewhere else. So this church, this Stave Church, which is in the folk museum there, and one of the oldest, they think was in 3 or 4 different places over the 800 years. It moved to the folk park in the 30s, and then in 1940 the whole church was disassembled and I think buried for the duration of the war. And by the way, I'm not really mentioning much about the war, but it dominates everything. Every place you go to, the war is mentioned in one way or another. Also, when we were leaving Trondheim, we saw this boat here, which was on the move. Now, so Trondheim itself is about 30 miles from the open sea, but the end of the Trondheim fjord, a place called Stinker up there, is about 80 miles from the open sea. And we spent a few weeks going up and back down the fjord. And it is, you'll see the colours here, it's the breadbasket of Norway. It's very, very warm. The average temperature is quite a bit higher. They're all cornfields, wheat fields, rolling countryside, really, really rich agricultural land, really bustling market towns. When we left Trondheim, we saw only a handful of sailing boats all the way up. And when we were in Stinker, we got talking to this very interesting man, and he said we were the first foreign boat he'd seen that year. You know, that people just don't go up there. But we discovered something interesting up there in Kjerknesvågen, which is just a little harbour. We didn't actually know much about it before we went in there, but it's yet another one of these associations. And here they have the jet called Pauline. So it's an association, they've all the workshops, they've loads of little boats around the place as well. But this boat here was built in 1860. It was clinker built originally, 83 feet on deck. In 1890-ish, it was rebuilt as carvel. It got an engine in 1915. It was actually in active service until the 70s. It's been brought back now to the way it would have been in the 1890 renovation. But it is used many times during the year. There were ads up, I think it was for about a tenner, you could have a day out on it. They use it, they bring it out. We didn't see it actually sailing. Lots of other boats up there. I just don't know the backgrounds, but all heritage. And again, they all look as if they are used fairly frequently. And of course, everywhere you go, there are old boat engines lying about. These out in the elements, so I don't know if they were just about to be moved into storage or what. And what we saw there was the boat we saw leaving Trondheim, 40 miles down the fjord. Now, I don't know what it is. It looks vaguely Colin Archer-esque. And this is something I discovered there. I don't know if it's the same everywhere, but in Norway, Colin Archer can mean a variety of things. It can mean designed and built by Colin Archer. It can mean designed by Colin Archer but built somewhere else. Or it can mean after the style of Colin Archer. And I didn't realise that. You know, people are telling me this is a Colin Archer. And it's only when I got back home and started reading up about it, I realised, well, I'm not quite sure what that meant.
Like a Hoover. Like a Hoover.
Yeah, indeed. So, leaving Stinker, we made a series of stops going north, up through Rorvik, past Ski, up to a place called Ålesund. But just north of Rorvik, just north of Ski, in fact, is the start of the county of Nordland. Now, this county is, many people think it is just the best sailing in Norway, and you know, our experience was it was magnificent. 270 miles from north to south, about 250,000 inhabitants, 14,000 islands, and coastline of about 14,000 miles. But you have everything. You have offshore islands, you have deep fjords, you have inner skerries, it just is mind-boggling. And their flag, this is the flag of Nordland County, is a Nordland boat. Just inside the county is what might be one of the most famous landmarks in Norway. This rock called Torghatten, it's 260 metres high, and it has that naturally occurring tunnel, which is about 160 metres right through the centre of it. And as you can imagine, it's immersed in Norse mythology. Somebody threw their hat in the air to stop an arrow, and when it landed, it became that rock mountain. Then just north of there, Brønnøysund is a small town. It's considered the boundary between North and South Norway, and also, I suppose not surprisingly, it's about halfway along the coastline between the Russian border and the Swedish border. We came across this boat, I know nothing about it, but it looked very pretty. So we then stopped in this place, Yetersund, just pulled in. It seemed to be a handy stop. But in beside us was this little boat, Bika. Now, Bika, her 28, its owner is Norwegian. He was from South Norway, she's from North Norway, Tromsø. But they'd wanted a herd for many years, and they were saying they were all very expensive. But they found one that was, they said, good value in Canada. So they bought it in Canada and they sold it back via Greenland, Iceland. It's been up and down the coast of Norway. They've had it down in the tropics as well. But I was talking to him and asking him about weather helm. And, you know, Sean Walsh and Kieran Nogue moved the mast a foot or two forward to try and compensate, or to try and reduce weather helm very successfully. And I was saying to Henrik, the guy there, about that. And he was saying, yeah, it does have weather helm, but a friend of his is a Norland boat builder. And his friend says, it's obvious it's going to have weather helm. The rudder is twice too big. And he advised Henrik, just cut off half the rudder and his problem would be solved. So he hasn't, as it happens 3 months later, we're on the hard beside each other and the rudder is intact and full size. So we're in Nordland, just there's infinite possibilities of anchorages, islands, one more interesting, one more beautiful than the next. A Colin Archer light boat we passed along the way. Here there's a little anchorage called Risvar. It's about 12 miles offshore, and that's the height of it. No habitation there at all, but lovely, lovely shelter. But the reason I show that is a view from just a slightly different aspect there from that anchorage is this island called Lovund. So it's 8 miles away, it's 16 miles offshore, and it rises 600 metres right out of the sea. It's famous for a few reasons, but one of the most interesting to me was, like, as we know in Ireland and as I gather in Norway, lack of opportunities for youth was a huge issue. And in the early 70s, locals got together and in an attempt to give opportunities for young people, they set up a cooperative which has gone from strength to strength, the cooperative being fish farming, and it now employs, I don't know how many people, but there are 500 people permanently living on the island. It's really vibrant. The cooperative has just recently built that whole breakwater. They're reclaiming land here that they need, I assume, to have processing, but it's just quite amazing. But further around the harbour, there's this building. And like, you know, so many buildings are just so spectacular. This is, I found, stunning. A simple cabin suspended on a series of A-frames facing the water. Quite modest from the land, but that happens to be the Lovund Boat Museum, which apparently is very, very good, but it was shut the day we were there. But I was able to look in the window and get a few glimpses. Also from the island, looking out to sea, 12 miles out is the archipelago of Træna, and that's where we went the next day. And note the radar station at the top of that peak. So here we are underneath that radar station. It is 270 metres up, just fairly sheer, as you can see there. Dominates the little anchorage we were in, which is quite exposed to the southwest, but that was fine. The wind was, I think, north the day we were there. There are hundreds of islands in the archipelago, but the Norwegian sense of humour is very droll, and in a local guide, which on the internet, which I translated using Google Translate, it said, an indisputable advantage of Norway's NATO membership is that there is a radar station at the top of Gumpen, and that there is therefore a road up there. the view from there is phenomenal. So they value their ability to get up there. Now, this cave here, there were 3 caves around the area. So when I say this cave, I might mean one of the other 2, because it wasn't clear, has had human habitation 10,000 years ago. Now, also, and this was complete news to me, on the island of Træna, on this island, they have a source of fresh water. I thought, oh yeah, of course they do. On neighbouring islands, they don't. They have to desalinate water. And they think that the fact that there was a source of fresh water on the island was a contributing factor as to why 10,000 years ago people chose to gravitate around there. They also think, and I don't know if this is a rumour, if it's a myth, if it's a fact, that the source of that water is through a geological fault from a glacier called Svartisen, which is 40 miles away. As I say, that's what I read, but I didn't know, like so much when you read it, is that a myth, is it a fact or not? But so here we are. There's the island of Træna we're talking about. And if we look in further, here, this is the glacier. It's the second largest glacier on mainland Europe. It's the glacier that's nearest the sea on mainland Europe. It's 221 kilometres square. And of course, it's receding. On the way there, just another anchorage, one of the infinite number. Just everywhere you look, there are anchorages you would die for. Just beautiful. And then on our way into the fjord near the glacier, we pass this little monument here. And there's a few of them around, all on the Arctic Circle, just to symbolise that's what you're passing. So going up the fjord, and the wind tends to reduce in fjords, we found it very pleasurable to just use the spinnaker for as long as we could, and we might be doing 3, 4 knots. But a lovely way to get around up to a really remote anchorage on a remote fjord off this remote fjord, a place called Nordfjordholm. So peaks here at 1,000 metres more or less, and this group of islands totally isolated, nobody living around, no permanent residents anyway for miles and miles. There probably are summer lodges in the forests. But it was so picturesque, it was magical, the view from it. It was tucked away amongst these islands, the huge cliffs, high peaks. I mean, this is, to my opinion, chocolate box beauty, absolutely stunning. I mean, even the dog was taken in by it. But the one thing we couldn't do here was get to the glacier. In years gone by, you could access the glacier from this end of the fjord here, but it's receded too much. So we went around to try and get to that glacier. So here we arrived, the glacier up there, this outlet glacier is called Engabri, and it has another record. It is the lowest altitude of any glacier on mainland Europe. So it was about 5 kilometres walk to the glacier. Got in there at about 6 o'clock one evening, beautiful sunny evening. It was going to be bright all night. Would we go that night or would we leave it till the next morning? And we left it till the next morning, which was a mistake. So we persevered. We got to maybe 500 metres of it. It was so cold, the damp falling down off that glacier. The rocks were slippy, so we turned back. Now, it was okay for us, but the poor dog really was traumatised by the whole thing. And, joking aside, we were starting to worry that he could potentially start getting into hypothermia territory. So much so, the next day, although it was sunny, he refused to get out of bed. So, we made, and a lot of these are remote anchorages going north. If we jump up here to the end of where I was showing, this is another archipelago called Fleinvær. It's about 2.5 miles by 2.5 miles. There are hundreds of islands in it. It's about 12 miles from the mainland. And it was very different and very special. This was the main island where we were. As you can see here, the charts are very helpful They basically draw any curved line like that, saying that the passage you can take, that's the passage you can take. Now this one here, for instance, it's saying you can take it, but minimum depth of 2 meters. But it sort of guides you. Now, the reason that this island, that this archipelago is so special, it just feels different. It's low-lying islands, rolling countryside. And maybe because of that, a famous artist lives there year-round and has lived there for years. And there's a community of artists starting to build up there. And the place has a very friendly, relaxed feel. It's absolutely gorgeous. There are no roads, there are no cars. I mean, that's the main road from one end of the island to the other. That's looking across the sound to every direction you look in. There are those low-lying islands. But what's particularly interesting here is, and I think that artist might have been the driving force behind it, there is a collection of houses used for artists' retreats and conventions and slightly alternative activities called the Arctic Hideaway. And this artist, the land was bought in about 20 years ago, and the artist happened to be able to get 2 of the most prominent Norwegian architects involved, who organised international workshops of architecture students, and they built these here. So there really are very alternative, stunning. They can be rented quite cheaply. They have conventions and meetings and gatherings and that type of thing. And it so happened, when we were out, we saw this. And I had no idea what it was. Turns out to be, he's a boat builder. That's an Orland boat, 130 years old. He doesn't bring it offshore that frequently. There was some convention on in village. He was coming over to it. So it was a real privilege to see it. Just to see it coming in. Now your man, I was talking to him, the boat builder, he years ago actually had sailed hookers in Roundstone. Now he couldn't remember when, he was on holidays, he got talking to somebody, and he was on a cycling holiday. But that's the Nordland boat itself. So from that archipelago, via Bodo, we head up to Kjerringøy, which I will get to in a second. Leaving Bodo, I spotted this. And it's unfortunate I didn't spot it when we were there. This is the Annabelle J. This is a Dungarvan couple who had sailed it up. They'd actually sailed it further north and were on the way back. It's a replica of a Bristol pilot cutter, steel, built in 1996. As I say, they'd sailed it up to Finnsnes, a town further north, and they were on the way back. But it is a real pity that we didn't get to meet there. Kjerringøy, this little town, is really another really interesting spot. The particularly interesting bit is up here. 100 years ago or 200 years ago, this was very, very isolated area. From here up to the north, there probably were virtually no permanent residents. And apparently people could not trade unless you had a license. And this place was a licensed trading post, which I didn't really know what it meant. They had a license to deal. They would have catered for the Lofoten Islands, for all the way into Narvik. They had sort of the equivalent of a post office. They had blacksmiths, they had workshops. They would buy fish from Lofoten, preserved fish, and then ship it down to Bergen at the end of the season. There could have been apparently hundreds of boats in the Sound on any day. There were occasions when hundreds of fishermen would have been sleeping in the lofts while waiting to get to Lofoten. But it was really interesting, and they had numerous boats. What was particularly fortuitous here is that its heyday was in the 19th century, and just around 1900 the owner died. The next generation let it go to rack and ruin, passed on to relations who did nothing with it, nothing, until in the 50s the museum bought it. So it was untouched from around 1900, and really interesting. heading up into Narvik. I mean, the sunlight photograph here, we know about the sun. This is completely untouched, no filter, nothing. This is about 10:30 at night. Everything was red. And it wasn't untypical, but that was the most extreme we had seen it. Anyway, that's on the way into Narvik. Now, Narvik is another fascinating place. So many places in Norway are fascinating, and it's just so, it was such a privilege to be able to have time to explore. But Narvik, this is the town here. This is the interesting bit of Narvik, the deep water port. So it's a population of about 14,000 people. It's the 41st largest city in Norway. It's 50 miles to the coast, and it's 120 miles to the open sea. So it really is deep inland. But it has that very, very deep harbour, 27-metre draft, and it's ice-free. Now, in the 19th century, a huge iron ore mine was being developed in the centre of Sweden, 400 kilometres away. And the obvious thing to do would have been to ship the ore down to the Baltic and export it from there. But the Baltic freezes. So the company did a survey, nobody lived in this area, and they decided they would build a railway and a town and a port in Narvik, which they did. The town was established in 1902, the railway was opened in 1902. They ship 25 million tonnes of ore annually on that railway. 100 carriage trains are running down that railway 24 hours a day. Hitler relied heavily on that iron ore, and the Allies didn't believe he would be able to get through the winter of 1940 without getting iron from here. So Norway was neutral, but there was discussion in the UK, in Britain, as to whether they'd mine the port, even neutral Norwegian territory. In the end, the Germans invaded, the British invaded. There were two major naval battles there. 12 destroyers were lost in there, 6 supply ships. It was huge, huge battleground. Britain, I believe, sort of won the battle, but they were losing heavily in Dunkirk, so they just withdrew and let the Nazis in. And Hitler had his supply of iron from that frost-free port for the winter. One last place I'll mention, not far from Narvik. There's this fjord, 13 miles deep. So we went up it for a couple of reasons. One thing about this spot here is you are just about 5 miles from the Swedish border at that spot. So Norway, mainland Norway, is only 5 miles deep there. The other thing was, it was a just very beautiful spot because of the fact that it looks as if it's an enclosed lake. So that's the way we came in there, but it gives the appearance of being an enclosed lake, and in fact an alpine lake. So these peaks on either side are 1,300 metres. Now, beautiful spot and all as it was, we were having breakfast down below one morning, and this noise started. I had no idea. This really, really, really loud, low frequency noise. I concluded it had to be a helicopter hovering over the boat. I assumed it was some type of drill. So I made my way up to the cockpit quickly enough, and there was no helicopter. It turned out to be a rock slide, maybe 500 metres away here. It went on for about a minute or maybe 2 minutes. It was really eerie. I mean, I was trying to think ahead and thinking when the rocks hit the water, what do I do? But they didn't. You know, they were stuck somewhere up there. But I will never forget that. The last jump of the trip was from that little fjord all the way up to Tromsø. At this stage, the holiday season was over in Norway. And I don't know if it was because of that or if it was because we were just going into a further north area, but we didn't see any interesting heritage boats from here on. But we did have some quite good sailing. but it's very challenging sailing, as in some days you'd be totally becalmed, totally and utterly, and you go 3-4 miles off and you'd get gusts of 40 knots. So it was interesting. So then on to Tromsø, population of about 42,000. It's referred to as the Paris of the North, although nobody seems to agree why. There are lots of different theories. I mean, it's got the most northerly university in the world, the most northerly cathedral. It's a lovely place, a lovely buzzing spot. We then went to the marina just north of Tromsø called Træna, where we overwintered. So we lifted the boat out, removed anything that could catch snow. It's not unknown to have maybe 3 meters of snow over the winter. So everything, the solar panels, the cockpit tent, everything horizontal that could come down was taken down. But at the end of the season, I mean, we were wondering all the time, why are there so many heritage boats? Everywhere you look, there's so many heritage boats, beautiful condition. And I'd asked the locals, and I never really got an answer. All we can think is that it's a combination of, there might have been so many boats, more boats to start off with there than there would have been in Ireland. That's how they communicated. The sea remains really central to their identity. They care about the sea. They invest in it. They put effort into it. Perhaps it was the quality of build to start off with. Perhaps it was the climate. Although it's harsh, maybe it just helps preserve better over the winter. It might be they've a great tradition of community associations where people volunteer and help, and the associations can seem to have assets like tools and things which are respected and left intact. It could be because of that inner lead, and the sailing up there is beautiful. There is very, very little swell and there is wind, so these boats probably can be used with much less wear on them than if they were going to be bashing into a 2 meter short swell or something like that. Or it might be the grants. There might be, and I'm sure there is, there seem to be grants for everything there. They're not an ostentatious people. They're extremely wealthy, as you know, but I think the government supports many things. Now, before I sign off, I would like to thank a few people. The only reason Dawn and I did or were able to do or undertook this cruise, which was fantastic, was Adrian invited me on his boat El Paradiso to return from Tromsø a few years ago, which gave me great insight, and it whet my appetite and it showed it could be done. And Paddy Barry, who has been so generous and helpful and encouraging with his wisdom and his humour, that between the two of you, I don't think we'd have done it otherwise. And finally, a very quick thank you to Jerry Keane, who was a bit of a catalyst in me accepting the opportunity with Adrian. He gave me a nudge and says, you really should do it. And I thought, and I did it. So thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm delighted to take them.
Did you get a job in the Norwegian Fallujah Ireland? No?
I'm sure we've a whole host of questions to ask Mark. I certainly have a few to ask him.
What sort of time scale for your...
We left Kilrush, I think it was around the 4th of May, and we left the boat in Tromsø around the 4th of September.
And to get from Kilrush to Norway?
3 weeks. And we could have done it in less. The weather was very good. I mean, we sort of factored in losing days here and there. We could have done it in 2. But yeah.
Mark, how do you manage for supplies? Because a lot of the areas seem very remote. How do you manage?
Well, that's really interesting. You'd think that from looking at it, but it's actually much better service than, say, the west coast of Ireland. Within a day or two, there's a little community, and all of the communities are focused on the sea, as that's their main way of transport. So you're always, within a day or two, you're beside a shop, bins, you get bins really everywhere you go. There's little pontoons with water everywhere. So although it's remote, the services are really good. And on that, the price of things were variable, but it wasn't as expensive overall, apart from drinking out, as people might think.
Did you come across many oil rigs offshore?
No, I don't think we saw one. I think they're slightly further north. Paddy will correct me, crossing the North Sea. I think they're north and south. We didn't. They weren't an issue going from Fair Isle to Bergen.
Where are you going next year?
Well, we had been planning to bring the boat around to the Baltic and leave it in Sweden next winter. One reason being that Norway isn't in the customs union, so basically we're very welcome there, but we have to be out within 2 years. But when I was talking to the customs people, they went to pains to point out, if I have AIS, all we need to do is go 12 miles offshore and turn around and come back in, and that resets everything. So we don't know. We might spend another winter in Norway, or we might go around to the Baltic.
That sounds a bit like an Irish solution to a Norwegian problem. I think I do think that you can't underestimate a country that has so much wealth in terms of oil. I mean, it is an extremely wealthy country. Their sovereign fund is hundreds of billions. And I'd imagine that there's plenty of grants for repair, restoration, they're in a different league.
They are. And their infrastructure, look, a bit of a problem going around the headland, build a tunnel. The bridges everywhere. But they seem to, and I'm not an economist, but I gather because they kept the sovereign fund not in Norwegian kroner, it didn't cause great inflation amongst the people, and they live comfortably, but not ostentatiously. They live modestly enough.
It's a good balance to have, that they're not ostentatious, and yet they have this underpinning wealth that they mean, they don't have to pay their way day in, day out. They have an enormous bankroll.
They do, yeah.
But also they must be keeping the skills to keep those boats. I mean, the boat builders must be still there, The
boat builders are, but I gather. And when you don't speak the language, it's hard to fully get the picture. But I gather they have a demographic problem in that the native Norwegians are not academically ambitious. They're happy doing what they've done. But yet the country needs all these professional people, which are being filled from outside, and that some of them, and I don't think this is a right-wing fear, that they sort of fear that they don't quite, that they may have a demographic issue in years to come.
Right. Man on the stool down there had a question, yeah?
Did you see many wet days when you were there? They all looked like sunny days.
In general, there were a few days where it was wet, and we lost a few days, probably 3 or 4 times. We had to spend 3 days in one particular place to let a weather system go over. But in general, it was really sunny, beautiful. But the locals, as I say, Stuart, the locals were at pains, all of them, that it's not normally like this.
There were very few days that we couldn't sail as well. I think there was only one set of 3 or 4 days when we couldn't sail.
Yeah.
Generally,
yeah.
we were able to go. It was incredible.
Mark, you must have had to use a lot of pilot books on that coast. Are they all in English language?
What I used is, there's one book from the RCC by a woman called Judy Lomax, which covers the whole 1,000 miles, and it's pretty good. And then there's a few, the Norwegian Cruising Guide, I think about 3 or 4 volumes, which I had in soft copy form. But there's numerous sites which I found invaluable that seem to be community-based, describing every little anchorage and every little harbour, and there'd be pictures of it. But you'd have to take it with a grain of salt because it was community-based, and it could have been, but that was invaluable, yeah.
So looks like there's a lot of man's sheds over around there.
Gentleman there had a question, did you? No? Sorry, Dennis.
I just wonder what life is like north of the Arctic Circle in winter, because you don't see the sun for a certain period of time at all.
That is true. Now, the woman on the herd, Nina, was from Tromsø, and we were asking her that a lot. And she was saying they get used to it, and that it actually, with snow on the ground, and you have maybe the sun doesn't rise, but you have twilight for maybe 4 or 5 hours, even in the very dead of winter. And if there's any moon at all, they can sort of do semi-outdoor activities. So she was saying it's not an issue to the locals. But it'll be interesting. Henrik, her husband from South Norway, when I talk to him in May, I'll ask him what he thought of the daylight over the winter.
Was there a lot of winterizing that you had to do, apart from the stopping the snow gathering, was there?
Yeah, what I did, and I was a bit nervous about this, I flushed antifreeze through the raw water intake. So there was no salt water in the cooling system. And with the domestic water, the locals were saying, no matter what you do, you will never drain it. You just won't. There'll be water lines somewhere. So you can get food grade antifreeze, which I put in the domestic water and let it flow through to each tap, and I'll rinse it out when I go back to the boat. And hopefully I'll be smiling about it when we next talk.
That picture of dawn in the midnight sun in the midsummer was just stunning. I think that was unbelievable.
The skies were magnificent tonight. Absolutely magnificent.
Sorry, the weather forecasting and stuff, were you on the local VHF or on your phone or what?
No, they encourage you to use the phone. Like VHF, they're saying try and contact the Coast Guard on the mobile. YR is what all the locals use. Incredibly accurate for the short term. It changes. You look at it and you think, oh, tomorrow afternoon there'll be 40 knots, and the next morning it'll be saying there's 22, and there'll be 22. But it gives hour by hour, very, very localised. And we found it really, really reliable for that day.
You had good coverage the whole way.
There was only that place under the radar station, the NATO radar station, we didn't have coverage. In Sør-Skjome, near the Swedish border, we didn't have coverage. There might have been one other place we didn't have coverage. Other than that, everywhere.
Does the GPS work very well all up around the islands?
Perfectly. Perfectly. For us, anyway.
Yeah.
Did you have any whale sightings?
No. Well, yes. On the way out of Trondheim, we saw a group of about 20, I think they were pilot whales, according to somebody who said they saw them on the way in. But that was it. We didn't see whales. Lots of sea eagles, lots of birds, Arctic terns, just so many birds of every description, but not. They were the only sea mammals we saw. And I think that was unusual. Most people see more.
Well, Mark, I think that was an absolutely amazing lecture and spectacularly interesting. And I'm sure I speak for everybody here when I say thank you very much indeed. A couple of comments I want to make myself. I've only had the pleasure of visiting Norway twice. Once was to the Viking museums in Gokstad and Oseberg. The other time was on a cargo ship. Didn't quite make the Arctic Circle, just down below it. But I remember speaking to the dockmaster, who was very, very interested in a place called Mo i Rana. It's just below the Arctic Circle, and he was very interested in traditional boats, of which there were a huge amount in that part of the world. Beautiful fjord, up the top of a fjord. And I remember he remarked, he said, nearly everybody in Norway is either a carpenter or a boat builder. And that's nearly borne out by the amount of timber buildings that you see, and all the timber boats. In addition to that, I met the man who was in charge of the Viking museums in Norway, a man called Arne Emil Christiansen, gave a talk in the Royal Irish Academy. And he mentioned, basically it was all about the traditional boats and the Viking finds, because they're forever finding new Viking finds. And he said he never had any problem with identifying what the parts were, because he said the boat builders were still using the very same methods, and all had all the terms and all. I recently had the pleasure of doing our DNA, our family DNA with all my siblings, and I was absolutely delighted to learn that we have some Norwegian blood in us. Again, I'd just like to show your appreciation to Mark.